The last surviving son of Abraham Lincoln spent 50 years destroying every trace of what he felt. He burned letters, tore up photographs, erased his own history. Why? Because of the four children born to America's greatest president, only one lived long enough to become an adult. One died at 3, another at 11, another at 18. And the only one who survived to age 82 carried a guilt heavy enough to follow him into his final breath. This isn't the story of Abraham Lincoln. It's the autopsy of a last name that executed a family in slow motion. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn was buried for 100 years. In 1861, when Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as president, Washington, D.C. smelled like mud and ambition. The city was literally a swamp. The unpaved streets turned into pits of sludge every time it rained. And the White House wasn't the imposing symbol we know today. It was a neglected building, leaks in the roof, rats in the walls, torn curtains. Mary Todd Lincoln cried the first night she saw her new home. But for the four boys who arrived from Springfield, Illinois, that rundown house felt like a giant castle. Robert was 17. He had just entered Harvard. Willie was 10, the smartest of them all. Tad was 7. He spoke with a heavy lisp because of his cleft palate. And Eddie wasn't there anymore. He had died 11 years earlier, at the age of 3, from tuberculosis. Death had already visited the Lincolns once, but no one imagined it would return 3 more times. Behind the crowds cheering at Lincoln's inauguration, behind the speeches about preserving the Union, were his sons. And for them, the presidency brought no glory. It was the beginning of something none of them would survive intact. What no one tells you about living in the White House during the Civil War is the constant noise. Military boots on marble floors, the hushed arguments of generals crafting strategies that would kill thousands. Mary Todd Lincoln crying every time she read the lists of the dead in the newspapers. Willie and Tad ran through those halls without fully understanding what was happening. They played pretend war with toy soldiers while outside. Real men died for the ideals their father defended. Abraham Lincoln worked 18 hours a day. He rose at 6 in the morning and didn't sleep until after midnight. When his son slipped into his office, he smiled at them with that tired smile you see in every photograph. He let them play under his desk while he signed orders that would send thousands of men to their deaths. Mary Todd tried to build some form of normal life within the chaos. She held elegant dinners while the war shredded the nation. She bought expensive dresses the press accused her of flaunting. And every night she checked her children's beds to make sure they were still breathing, because she knew something that terrified her, that losing Eddie had not been the end. It was only the beginning. And Washington, D.C., with its contaminated water, was a silent killer of children. Every time Willie or Tad coughed, Mary panicked. Every time they had a fever, she called multiple doctors. Senators mocked her paranoia. Journalists called her hysterical. But Mary Todd Lincoln knew something the rest of the country would learn too late, that the White House itself was killing her sons. For decades, nobody dared speak openly about what it truly meant to be the child of a wartime president. But buried truths always rise eventually. And if you believe some stories must be told without fear, subscribe. Because what you're about to hear about the Lincolns was muted for more than a century. In February 1862, Willie Lincoln fell ill. Fever, headaches. Mary assumed it was just a cold, but the fever wouldn't break. His nighttime sweating drenched the sheets. He drifted in and out of delirium, calling for Tad in fevered whispers. And Abraham Lincoln, the man making decisions that affected millions, sat helplessly beside his son's bed. The doctors suspected typhoid. The Potomac's water was contaminated. Half the city was sick. But Willie was young, strong. Surely he would recover. He didn't. But you need to know who Willie was to understand why his death shattered Abraham Lincoln in a way even the war never could. Willie Lincoln was born December 21st, 1850. His mother called him "my little philosopher," because from age 5 he asked questions adults couldn't answer. Why is the sky blue? Where does the sun go when it hides? Why do some people own slaves and others don't? That last question he asked at age 7. Abraham was preparing a case when Willie appeared in the doorway and blurted it out. Abraham stopped, looked at his son, and gave him the only honest answer he had. "I don't know, Willie, but I will spend my life making sure that one day nobody has to wonder. Willie devoured every book he could find. By 9, he had read more than most adults. He memorized entire poems after hearing them once. He wrote letters full of sharp, funny observations. When the family moved to Washington, Willie was 10, and the White House mesmerized him. He explored every corner and discovered hidden passages even staff didn't know about. But what he loved most was sitting with his father. He would sit quietly on the floor of Abraham's office while he worked. Occasionally, Lincoln looked up and asked, "What do you think, Willie?" And Willie, with perfect seriousness, offered opinions that made the generals in the room grin. There was something in Willie that suggested greatness, not the loud, showy greatness of politicians, but something deeper: kindness, intellect without ego. Lincoln once confided to a friend, "Of all my sons, Willie is the one who reminds me most of myself, but better, much better." And then everything collapsed. The fever started Thursday, February 6th. By Friday, Willie couldn't stand. Saturday, he was delirious. Sunday, his breathing turned uneven. And on Thursday, February 20th, at 1 in the afternoon, Willie Lincoln stopped breathing. Abraham Lincoln was there. He had been there for hours, holding Willie's hand, telling him everything would be all right lying, because they both knew it wouldn't. When Willie died, Abraham lifted him into his arms, rocked him like a baby, and cried with a sound his secretaries described as an animal's wounded howl. The man holding together a fractured nation broke completely while holding the cold body of his 11-year-old son. Mary Todd heard his scream from her bedroom and knew instantly Willie was gone. She couldn't go see him. She stayed in bed, screaming Willie's name until her voice gave out. For weeks, she didn't leave her room. She didn't attend the funeral. She didn't see her sons embalming in the green room, or the long line of strangers filing past the coffin. She didn't see her husband stand beside Willie for 5 silent hours after the funeral, staring. Lincoln ordered the coffin opened twice more, once a week later, once 2 months later. He needed to see Willie again, to be sure he was really gone. Staff whispered that the president was losing his mind, wandering into the room where Willie died, sitting in the dark, talking to himself, breaking down in cabinet meetings. But they didn't understand. Lincoln hadn't just lost a son, he had lost the last uncorrupted thing in his life. And Willie had died because of the White House, because of contaminated water, because his father had become president. And then Tad fell ill. Same symptoms, same fever, same poison running through the water. For a week, Abraham Lincoln thought he would lose 2 sons. He sat between 2 beds, one with a dead child, one with a dying one, reading the Bible aloud, though he barely believed in God anymore. Mary couldn't enter the room. She listened from the hallway praying. And somehow Tad lived. When he woke, he asked for Willie. Abraham told him, and Tad, who could barely speak clearly, whispered, "Was it my fault? Did I make him sick?" Lincoln held him tight and said no. But Tad never believed it fully. While all this happened, Robert Lincoln was hundreds of miles away at Harvard, oblivious. He was 18, the eldest, the heir, the one expected to carry the name forward. But his relationship with his father was distant, never hostile, just emotionally empty. Robert received the telegram about Willie while studying. "Willie died this afternoon. Come home at once." He took the first train. 18 hours without crying, because he had learned early that emotions were private things, buried deep. When he reached the White House, Willie was already embalmed. Mary was sedated. Lincoln was in war meetings, and Tad was recovering. Robert stayed 3 days, attended the funeral, watched strangers cry harder than he could. Then he returned to Harvard, because that was expected. Be strong. Don't let tragedy interrupt duty. But something dark rooted inside him, a sense that his family was cursed, that the name Lincoln carried a weight he would one day pay for. Tad Lincoln was born with a cleft palate. Doctors could do nothing in 1853, but Lincoln adored this son, imperfect, vulnerable, sweet. Tad spent his days in his father's office, mispronouncing words that made Lincoln laugh. He was wild, unpredictable, bursting into cabinet meetings, dragging goats into hallways. Staff complained. Lincoln just smiled and said, "Let him be a boy. Soon enough, he must be a man." After Willie died, Tad changed. The wild boy went quiet. He stared for hours at the bed where Willie had died. He stopped laughing. At 8 years old, he had learned a brutal truth. Death was unfair and unstoppable. Mary became consumed by fear. She monitored Tad constantly, terrified to lose a third child. On April 14, 1865, Abraham invited the family to Ford's Theater to see a comedy. For the first time in years, he needed a laugh. The war had ended 6 days earlier. Robert didn't go. He was tired. It was the last thing he ever said to his father. Tad went to a different theater with his tutor. In the middle of the show, someone shouted, "They've shot the president!" Panic erupted. Tad tried to ask what happened, but his lisp was so strong no one understood his words, only his terror. He was rushed to the White House. His father wasn't there. Lincoln lay across the street, dying slowly with a bullet in his head. Mary was hysterical. Robert held his father's hand. Tad wasn't allowed inside. Too young, they said. Too traumatic. So Tad stayed behind at the White House, alone in his room, 12 years old, waiting for someone to tell him whether his father was alive or dead. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. And with that death, something inside Mary Todd Lincoln shattered beyond repair. She had already lost Eddie. She had lost Willie. Now she had lost her husband. And in her fractured mind, a terrifying belief formed that someone was hunting her family. That there was a curse. That all Lincolns were destined to die. Desperate, Mary threw herself into spiritualism. She hired mediums who claimed they could communicate with Abraham, with Willie, with Eddie. She spent fortunes on seances where supposed spirits spoke through dim candlelight. Anyone else could see the fraud, but Mary needed to believe, because the alternative, that her dead were simply dead and unreachable, was unbearable. Tad sat beside her during these seances, 12, 13, 14 years old, sitting in dark rooms while his mother asked the dead whether they forgave her, whether Abraham blamed her for not going to the theater that night, whether Willie missed her as much as she missed him. And Tad, who could barely speak clearly, couldn't bring himself to tell her to stop, that the dead weren't answering, that only the two of them remained alive and barely surviving. Robert visited occasionally from Chicago. Every visit ended in an argument. Robert insisted the mediums were con artists, that Mary needed to accept reality. Mary screamed that Robert didn't understand, that he hadn't been there when Willie died, that he'd chosen Harvard over his own family, that he was cold and unfeeling. Robert left and Tad stayed because someone had to take care of his mother. And that someone was him, a teenager with a cleft palate who couldn't express his own emotions yet, was responsible for carrying the emotions of a woman losing her mind. In 1868, Mary decided to leave America entirely. She said she needed to escape. The country reminded her too much of what she'd lost. She took Tad with her, 15 years old, again without being asked, because Tad was all she had left. They lived in Germany, then in France. Mary bought clothing she didn't need, stayed in expensive hotels she couldn't afford. Her widow's pension evaporated in weeks. Robert sent money from Chicago. Mary spent it instantly. But for Tad, Europe was something else entirely. For the first time in his life, no one knew who he was. No one looked at him with pity. He wasn't the son of the murdered president. He was just Tad. He attended European schools. Other children mocked his speech at first, but Tad was charming, funny, bright. He learned German with astonishing ease. In fact, his German became better than his English, because his cleft palate distorted English sounds more than German ones. For the first time since Willie's death, Tad seemed genuinely happy. He made friends. He attended parties. He talked about studying at a German university, maybe never returning to America. And then Mary decided it was time to go back. She never explained why. Maybe she missed Robert. Maybe the money had finally run out. Or maybe she realized she couldn't escape the ghosts forever. Tad didn't want to return. At 18, for the first time, he had found a place where he felt like himself. But he obeyed, because he always obeyed his mother, because he was the last child she had left, and that responsibility outweighed any desire of his own. And here comes the question no one dares say aloud. Was Abraham Lincoln America's greatest president, or an absent father who sacrificed his family for the nation? If you think he was a hero who saved the Union, write in the comments, Lincoln saved America. If you think he chose power over his children, write, he chose the White House. And if you think some truths must be told even when they're uncomfortable, subscribe, because what happened in the final minutes of Tad Lincoln's life changed Robert Todd forever. The voyage from Europe to New York took 2 weeks. Tad developed a cough on the ship. The doctors said it was due to the cold Atlantic air. Nothing serious. He'd recover once they reached land. But the cough worsened. When they arrived in New York in May 1871, Tad had a fever, difficulty breathing. Mary panicked. She hired doctors, paid extravagant fees, prayed harder than she had prayed since Abraham's death. They traveled to Chicago, where Robert was waiting. Robert placed them in the Clifton Hotel, hired the best doctors in the city, and waited because that was all he could do. The doctors changed their diagnosis repeatedly. Pneumonia, then acute bronchitis. Finally, they admitted it was probably tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed Eddie 20 years earlier. Tad's lungs were filling with fluid. There was no cure. Mary lay beside Tad in bed. She didn't sleep, didn't eat. She held him, whispering he would be fine lying, because both of them knew he wouldn't. Robert visited every 2 days, stayed for half an hour, spoke to the doctors, reviewed financial matters, then left. Years later, he admitted, with brutal honesty, that he couldn't bear to watch another brother die. He had seen enough death. Tad Lincoln died on July 15, 1871 at 7:30 in the morning. He was 18. He died in his mother's arms in a hotel room in Chicago, while Robert sat in a chair in the corner watching. This time, Mary didn't scream. She didn't cry like she had for Willie. She simply held the lifeless body of her last child, rocking him as if she could still put him to sleep, humming the lullabies she used to sing when he was a baby, before the White House, before the war, before everything turned to ash. Robert rose from his chair, his legs barely supporting him. He had been awake all night waiting for something he already knew would happen. He called the doctors. He arranged for the death to be certified. While handling the practicalities funeral arrangements, paperwork part of him watched from afar, thinking, I am the only one left, the only Lincoln who reached adulthood. Why me? That night, after everything was over, Robert locked himself in his office and cried for the first time since his father's death 6 years earlier. He cried for Willie, the brilliant brother who died at 11. For Tad, the fragile brother who never had a chance. For Eddie, whom he barely remembered but whose absence always hovered over the family. And he cried for himself, for being the survivor, for carrying a last name that now felt synonymous with death. But the story didn't end with Tad. In many ways, it was just beginning, because what came next was something no one expected. Mary Todd Lincoln lost her mind completely, not gradually, not in a way that could be managed with occasional visits or calming words. She crossed an invisible line and never returned. It began with shopping. After Tad's funeral, Mary bought compulsively dresses she'd never wear, curtains for houses she didn't own, jewelry she kept in unopened boxes. She spent thousands in days. Stores across Chicago sent bills to Robert, and when he asked her why she bought so much, she stared blankly, as if she didn't remember doing it. Then came the hallucinations. Mary saw Abraham walking through her room. She saw him sitting in his favorite chair reading the paper. She had full conversations with him, asking his opinion and waiting for answers. The household staff reported she screamed in the middle of the night, that she wandered outside in her nightgown shouting that someone was following her, that she insisted her food was being poisoned. In March 1875, Mary appeared at Robert's office carrying thousands of dollars sewn into her dress. She said they were coming for her. She had to hide. Chicago wasn't safe. When Robert asked who they were, Mary couldn't answer. She only repeated, "They're coming." Robert made the hardest decision of his life. He consulted doctors, lawyers, family friends. All agreed. Mary was a danger to herself. She needed to be committed. On May 19, 1875, Robert brought his mother to a sanity trial. 17 witnesses testified about her erratic behavior. Doctors diagnosed mania and delusions. Shopkeepers described her compulsive spending. Servants recounted her hallucinations. Mary sat in court in the black dress she'd worn to Tad's funeral, watching her only surviving child present evidence that she was insane. Her eyes were not filled with madness. They were filled with betrayal, a silent question. How could you do this to me? The trial lasted 3 hours. The jury deliberated 10 minutes. The verdict, Mary Todd Lincoln, was mentally incompetent and must be institutionalized. When the judge read the verdict, Mary looked at Robert and said, with painful clarity, "How could you do this? I'm your mother, the only family you have left." And Robert, voice trembling yet firm, answered, "It's the only way to save you." But both of them knew the truth. He wasn't saving her. He was locking her away. And neither of them would ever heal from that. Mary was sent to Bellevue Place, a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois. It wasn't brutal like many asylums of the time. It had gardens, private rooms, decent meals, but it was still a prison. She could walk the grounds but couldn't leave. She couldn't handle her own money or make decisions. She'd lost all legal rights, all because her son declared her insane. For 4 months, Mary wrote letters, dozens of them, to politicians who had known Abraham, to old friends, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. They all said the same thing. She wasn't insane. Her son had betrayed her. He wanted her inheritance. She was locked away out of greed. And the letters worked. Public pressure exploded. Newspapers questioned the verdict. Prominent women in Chicago wrote open letters defending Mary. Politicians who had admired Abraham Lincoln publicly stated his widow deserved better. In September 1875, Mary Todd Lincoln was released, not because she had recovered, because the scandal had become too large. A second trial declared her competent enough to manage her affairs. She was free, but the damage was permanent. Mary never forgave Robert. Instead of returning to Chicago, she moved to Springfield to live with her sister far from her son, as far as she could be without leaving Illinois. Robert visited twice a year out of obligation. The visits lasted less than an hour. They exchanged cold pleasantries. "How are you?" "Fine. Do you need anything?" "No." Then he left, guilty but unable to repair what he'd broken. Mary spent her last years in the same city where she had married Abraham, where all 4 of her children had been born. She lived in an upstairs bedroom, rarely opened the curtains because the light hurt her eyes, suffered chronic back pain, and relied on laudanum to function. Her nights were spent staring at the ceiling, remembering. In her bedside drawer, she kept a wooden box Abraham had given her on their 10th anniversary. Inside were love letters he had written before the presidency, before the war, when happy endings still seemed possible. She read them over and over until she memorized every word, crying silently because the man who wrote them no longer existed. He had been replaced by the myth, the Abraham Lincoln of statues and history books, and a myth cannot comfort you when ghosts visit your room. She also kept photographs, one of Willie, one of Tad, one of Eddie painted from descriptions since he died before photography was common, and one of the entire family taken in 1861, just after Lincoln became president. In that photo, they were all alive, all smiling. Mary stared at it often, wondering at what exact moment everything began to fall apart. She died on July 16, 1882, at 63 years old, in the same room where she had married Abraham 40 years earlier. She died alone except for her sister sleeping in a chair in the corner. She died without reconciling with Robert, whispering names, Abraham, Willie, Eddie, Tad, calling to the dead, hoping to join them. Robert organized her funeral. Fewer than 20 people attended, mostly distant relatives, bound by obligation rather than affection. No emotional speeches, no crowds. The former First Lady of America's bloodiest war died almost forgotten. The press barely covered her passing small notes on page 3. Mary Todd Lincoln, widow of the president, dies at 63. No details, no tributes. As if her whole life could be reduced to that title. Robert didn't cry at the funeral, not because he felt nothing, but because he had long ago learned that emotions were private, buried deep. Afterward, he returned to Chicago, to his successful law career, his wife and children, his carefully built routine, where no one mentioned Abraham Lincoln unless he did. And he almost never did. For the first time in his life, Robert Todd Lincoln was truly alone. No parents, no brothers. The last survivor of a family destiny had erased. But the strangeness surrounding the name Lincoln was not finished with him. In fact, it was only beginning. Robert lived 50 more years after his mother's death, 50 years in which he built a thriving life. He became one of Chicago's most respected lawyers, then a wealthy businessman through railroad investments. In 1881, he was appointed Secretary of War under President James Garfield, later continuing under President Chester Arthur. He and his wife Mary Harlan had 3 children, Mary, Abraham, Jack, and Jesse. He was a good father present, but not smothering, gentle but firm. He tried to give his children what he never had, a father who was emotionally there. But his closest friends noticed something, a distance, an invisible wall between Robert and the world. He could stand in a crowded room laughing, charming everyone, and still feel utterly alone. And then there was the other thing, the strange thing, the thing Robert noticed with growing horror. Presidents died when he was near. The first time was his father in 1865. Robert wasn't at Ford's Theater when the shot was fired, but he arrived minutes later and held Abraham's hand for the 9 hours it took him to die. The second time was James Garfield, when Robert was Secretary of War. He was at the Washington train station when Charles Guiteau approached the president and fired. Robert heard the shot, saw Garfield fall, and for one awful moment relived the night his father died. The same sound, the same sudden collapse, the same feeling that the world had stopped. Garfield didn't die immediately. He agonized for 11 weeks in which doctors shoved unwashed hands into his bullet wound, causing massive infections. Robert visited the dying president and saw his father's death replayed in every moment of suffering. When Garfield finally died on September 19, 1881, Robert Todd Lincoln made a decision. He would never again work so close to the presidency. He resigned as Secretary of War soon after and withdrew to private life Chicago, his businesses anywhere far from Washington. But distance wasn't enough. In 1901, Robert Todd Lincoln attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He didn't want to go. He was 58, semi-retired. But President William McKinley insisted. "Come on, Robert, it'll be fun. Just a few days, no politics, just celebration." On September 6th, Robert stood in the receiving line, waiting to greet the president. The line moved slowly, McKinley shaking hands, smiling, exchanging polite words. Then a man named Leon Czolgosz stepped forward. His right hand was wrapped in a white cloth, as if bandaged. McKinley, trying to be courteous to an apparently injured man, extended his left hand. Czolgosz fired twice, point blank, straight into the president's abdomen. Robert Todd Lincoln stood less than 10 feet away. He saw everything, the flash of the gun, the look of shock on McKinley's face, the bloom of blood spreading across his white shirt, the president collapsing, and Robert froze. Not out of fear, but because his mind could not comprehend that this was happening again, that for the third time in his life, he was standing beside a president at the moment he was assassinated. McKinley died 8 days later from gangrene, and Robert, standing at yet another presidential funeral, made a vow he kept for the rest of his life. He would never again attend any event where a sitting president was present. It became an absolute rule. When Theodore Roosevelt invited him to the White House, Robert refused. When Taft invited him, refused. It didn't matter who was president or how important the occasion was. People laughed at his superstition, calling it the eccentricity of an aging man. But Robert meant it literally. "I am a curse. Presidents die when I am near. I will not be responsible for another death." Was it true? Was it a curse? Or just 3 terrible coincidences? Robert never knew, but he would not take the chance. Yet there was another curse in his life, one more personal, one he could not outrun: the deaths of Lincoln's sons. In 1890, his own son, Abraham Lincoln II, called Jack by the family, developed a boil on his arm. It was common, painful, but treatable. Doctors drained it, applied ointments, assured the family he would recover. But the wound became infected. The infection spread to his bloodstream. Septicemia, they called it. There were no antibiotics in 1890, no effective treatment. They could only watch as Jack's body slowly poisoned itself. Jack Lincoln died on March 5, 1890, at 16 years old. He died screaming in pain while his father held his hand, just as Robert had held Abraham Lincoln's hand 25 years before. And at 47, Robert Todd Lincoln finally understood something devastating. Every generation of Lincolns was destined to bury its children. Eddie died at 3, Willie at 11, Tad at 18, now Jack at 16. The name Lincoln didn't only claim lives in public, it claimed them in private as well. And Robert was the only one who lived long enough to witness every loss. After Jack's death, Robert changed permanently. He withdrew deeper into himself, spent hours in his office without speaking. His two daughters, Mary and Jessie, would visit and find a father who was physically present but emotionally absent, as if part of him had died with his son. Then he developed an obsession, controlling his legacy, not his father's. That was already carved into marble in textbooks, but his own, the real story of what it had meant to be a Lincoln, and he decided no one would ever know it. Robert Todd Lincoln possessed boxes of personal papers, letters his father had written him as a boy, diaries he kept during the Civil War, correspondence with his mother during her decline, documents about her commitment to the asylum, private family photos never seen by the public. And Robert decided to destroy them, not some, not the most sensitive ones, all of them. It wasn't impulsive. He thought about it for years, discussed it with his daughters. He explained that the Lincoln family had already given enough to the public. His father belonged to history, but their private emotions, the fears, the doubts, the betrayals, those would die with him. His daughters begged him to reconsider. Jessie once said, "Father, these documents are history. Future historians will need them to understand grandfather." Robert's response haunted her for life. Let historians study his public speeches. His private life, our private life, is no one's business. In 1923, at 80 years old, nearly blind from cataracts, Robert began systematically destroying his personal history. He burned letters, tore up photographs, shredded diaries. Anything too personal, too human, too real into the fire. Some employees tried to save certain documents, hiding letters they believed too important to lose. But Robert was meticulous. He inspected everything personally. When he found something hidden, he destroyed it instantly. What was in those papers? We will never know. Perhaps letters where Abraham doubted the war. Perhaps diary entries where Robert admitted he hated carrying the Lincoln name. Perhaps proof that Abraham and Mary Todd's marriage was far more complicated than the romantic legend suggests. Or maybe they were simply the thoughts of a son trying to understand why he survived when everyone else did not, why he lived to 80 while Willie barely reached 11, what it meant to be the last one, and whether it was worth it. But Robert Todd Lincoln decided those questions would die with him. Some truths were too heavy to share, and the full reality of being a Lincoln was something he believed no one else needed or deserved to know. Robert Todd Lincoln died on July 26, 1926, at 82 years old in his sleep at his estate in Vermont. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the only one of Abraham Lincoln's children to grow old. His daughters honored his final instructions. The few remaining personal papers were destroyed after his death. The private history of the Lincolns, at least Robert's version, ceased to exist. His funeral was small, dignified, but not grand. A few politicians attended out of obligation, some close friends, a handful of elderly Civil War veterans who remembered him as the son of the great emancipator. There were no great crowds, no sweeping tributes, because Robert never wanted to honor the Lincoln name. He only wanted to survive it, and after 82 years, he finally had. But there is one detail almost no one mentions, one that reveals more about Robert than any speech or document ever could. For 50 years after his father's death, strangers approached him in public, on streets, in restaurants, at social events. They begged him to tell the story of being in the room when Abraham Lincoln died, to describe the exact moment his father stopped breathing, to explain what he felt. And Robert always answered with the same words, "That is none of your concern." Not angry, not sad, just firm enough to end the conversation immediately. It was how he survived silence, distance, refusal to turn trauma into entertainment. But in private letters, rare ones that survived only because they belonged to other people, not him. Robert admitted something he never said publicly. He felt guilty for surviving. He wondered why he lived to 82 while Willie died at 11, why Tad died at 18, why Jack died at 16. Why he alone kept breathing decade after decade. One letter written to a distant cousin in 1920 contains the most devastating line of all. At 77 years old with 6 years left to live, Robert wrote, "Sometimes I think survival was not a blessing. It was only a slower way of dying. Because being the last is not triumph or victory, it is loneliness. It is watching everyone you love disappear while you remain. It is asking yourself every day, why me? Why not Willie, who was brighter? Why not Tad, who was kinder? Why was the one who survived the one who always felt the most distant?" Robert spent the 50 years after Tad's death building walls of professional success, of carefully ordered domestic life, of destroyed documents no one could ever read, and he died alone behind those walls. The last Lincoln, the only survivor of a family fate had chosen to erase. Of the 4 children of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln, only one grew old. Eddie died at 3, Willie at 11, Tad at 18, Robert at 82. Was it a curse? Coincidence? The brutality of 19th century medicine? Maybe we will never know. Robert made sure the answers died with him. But we do know this. Being a Lincoln was not a privilege. It was a price paid with their lives, their sanity, their right to be remembered as human beings instead of footnotes in the biography of a great man. And the extinction of the Lincoln bloodline didn't end with Robert, it continued with surgical precision. Robert had 3 children, Mary, Abraham, Jack, and Jesse. Jack died at 16. The 2 daughters survived to adulthood, but neither continued the Lincoln name. Mary married Charles Isham. They had a son, Lincoln Isham. Lincoln, now a first name, not a surname. He had no sons. The line ended. Jessie married twice. She had 2 children, Mary Lincoln Beckwith and Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. Again, Lincoln is a first name, a symbolic echo, not a lineage. Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith died in 1985, and with him, the direct line of Abraham Lincoln ended. There are no living male descendants today. No one carries the Lincoln surname with a direct bloodline to the 16th president, as if the universe decided the name had served its purpose, and now slowly, inevitably, must disappear. Because in the end, the name Lincoln wasn't just a name, it was a sentence carried out in slow motion. Eddie died before he understood what it meant. Willie died in the White House still believing he was his father's favorite. Tad died believing he might have become someone else in Europe. Jack died of an infection that would be easily treatable today. And Robert died after a lifetime trying to be invisible. 4 generations, none escaped unscarred. And the 5th simply ceased to exist. Mary Todd Lincoln died calling to her dead children. Abraham Lincoln died with a bullet in his head. And every one of their descendants died, in a sense, from the weight of a name too large, too heavy, too impossible to carry. Was it a curse? The price of power? The tragedy of being human in a violent century? Maybe the answer doesn't matter. The outcome was the same. A family erased, a surname extinguished, a silence imposed by the only man who survived it. And these stories remind us that behind every president is a family that bleeds in silence, that pays prices the public never sees, that carries burdens no monument can honor. Because no one chooses where they are born. But the Lincolns learned they couldn't choose how they died either. That privilege was taken from them by a last name that became less an inheritance and more a sentence. If the story of Abraham Lincoln's children left you speechless, wait until you hear what happened to the children of John F. Kennedy. Another president assassinated in public, another family destroyed by fame, another curse that haunted the Kennedys for 3 generations in ways that make the Lincoln tragedy seem almost merciful. Because what happened to John F. Kennedy Jr., America's golden boy, the man with everything, beauty, intelligence, money, a name that opened every door, was the kind of disaster no one saw coming. He died at 38 in a crash that shocked the nation. Because in the end, no one fully escapes their name. The Lincolns tried for 4 generations. The Kennedys tried for 3. And both families learned the same devastating truth. Some legacies weigh more than any life, and some names are not inheritances, they are sentences.